Hello everyone, Palya, welcome. I wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we sit today and thank them for the opportunity to live well and healthy on their country. They took care of it for thousands of years before other people arrived, and as a result today we have the benefit of enjoying the bountiful fruits of this land. So I want to acknowledge those ancestors past, the elders present, and our emerging leaders and elders of the future from the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Thank you for having us on your country today. So, let me begin with sacred leadership. Today's event comes out of 6 years of my own research, but also a lifetime of working as a leader and a manager in various occupations, and particularly one where I worked as a transformational leadership consultant here in Sydney some years ago, about 10 years ago, and it was there that I learnt about Professor Robert Kegan from Harvard and his research into sacred leadership. And so I thought to myself, in fact, I've had sacred leaders in my culture, and one day I bought a man who was my cultural father, a traditional owner of Uluru who's now passed away, a man we call Kumanara Randall. And he was what I considered the embodiment of sacred leadership. And I took him to Sapphire one day to meet everybody, and his storytelling was profound for the people in the room. In fact, a number of those people cried that day. He was a man who'd had a very traumatic life, was stolen from his country near Kings Canyon at the age of 7, and took 40 years to find his people. But at the end of his life, he carried the law of Kanyini, which is to live in harmony and be at peace with all things, and to express unconditional love into the world. And a number of people here in this room today have been to his country and have had the opportunity to meet him and have felt, I think, the sacredness of his life. So he spent his life returning to the law of Kanyini as a way of living and being, which I believe is the basis for sacred leadership. So I've taken Robert Kegan's work and the work of other people in the leadership field, and I did a PhD about it. And I put it together with the Aboriginal development and education system to see if, in fact, we had a form of sacred leadership that was based around the theories of Kegan, and I found a correlation. So that's the work we're going to talk about today. In fact, the beginning of life and the end of life, the whole of life, is where we live as sacred beings. This is the essential core essence of Aboriginal culture. We consider ourselves sacred, children are sacred, children emerge from a sacred relationship with the Chukapa, which white people call the dreaming, we say the Chukapa, which is the all-encompassing environment of the other world and this one, where we believe the higher being, our ancestors, and we live as one. And so we consider ourselves sacred beings, and we bring our children up into the world to be sacred beings. Our whole society and development system was based on this one premise. So I'm just going to invite Arika Errington, a Waka Waka Woolly Woolly woman, and my daughter, who has also got her baby, her 19-day-old baby on her chest. So 3 generations of Waka Waka Woolly Woolly woman here. And she is going to read Didiri. So I want you to begin today by Didiri, which we call deep listening. So Didiri was spoken by one of our elders, Miriam Ungamer, some years ago, and given to Australia during the Decade of Reconciliation as a gift to the nation. So this is Didiri.
Palya. Didiri is a social quality, a unique gift of our people. It is inner, deep listening and quiet, still awareness. Didiri recognises the deep spring that is inside us. It makes us feel whole again. In our way, we learnt to listen from our earliest times. We could not live good and useful lives until we listened. We are not threatened by silence. We are completely at home in it. Our Aboriginal way has taught us to be still and wait. We do not try to hurry things. We let them follow their natural course, like the seasons. We watch the moon in each of its phases. We wait for the rain to fill our rivers and water the thirsty earth. When twilight comes, we prepare for the night. At dawn, we rise with the sun. We watch the bush foods and wait for them to open before we gather them. We wait for our young people as they grow, stage by stage through their initiation ceremonies. When a relation dies, we wait for a long time with the sorrow. We own our grief and allow it to heal slowly. We wait for the right time for our ceremonies and our meetings. The right people must be present. Careful preparations must be made. We don't mind waiting because we want things to be done with care. Sometimes many hours will be spent on painting our body before an important ceremony. We don't worry. We know that in time and in the spirit of deep listening, Didiri, the way will be made clear. We are like the tree standing in the middle of a bushfire, sweeping through the timber. The leaves are scorched and the tough bark is scarred and burnt. But inside the tree, the sap is still flowing, and under the ground, the roots are still strong. Like that tree, we have endured the flames, and we still have the power to be reborn. Our people are used to the struggle and the long waiting. We still wait for the white people to understand us better. We ourselves have spent many years learning about the white man's ways. We have learnt to speak the white man's language. We have listened to what he had to say. This learning and listening should go both ways. We would like people in Australia to take time and listen to us. We are hoping people will come closer. We keep on longing for the things we have always hoped for: respect and understanding. We know that our white brothers and sisters carry their own particular burdens. We believe that if they let us come to them, if they open up their minds and hearts to us, we may listen and lighten their burdens. There is a struggle for us, but we have not lost our sense of Didiri. There are deep springs within each and every one of us. Within the deep spring, which is the very spirit, is a sound, the sound of deep calling to the deep. The time for rebirth is now. If our culture is alive and strong and respected, it will grow. It will not die, and our spirit will not die. We believe the spirit of Didiri that we have to offer will blossom and grow, not just within ourselves, but also our whole nation. Palia.
Well done for doing that with baby on chest. Not bad. So today I ask you to listen in the spirit of Didiri. So is being sacred a journey worth exploring? Why would we do that? Well, one of the things that I was taught from a very young age was that being sacred is innate in you as a human being. So within us we have the qualities and abilities and ways of being and virtues which are sacred, and that those powers are within us when we are born. So it's part of the spirit part of ourselves. The Aboriginal people would say the Kurumpa. And these are some of the qualities. So when Professor Keegan did his work, he looked at a lot of different companies around the world, and mostly research done with non-Indigenous people, obviously. That was his world experience. but he discovered that 8% of the world's leaders of major companies are what he considered at a sacred level. And he started 40 years ago at Harvard Graduate School of Education with a theory. He developed the theory of consciousness called the object and subject theory, which is extremely complex as a psychological theory. But what comes out of it is that through our developmental processes as human beings, we go through stages of development. And if our stages of development are arrested, then we will not reach certain levels of consciousness. So it's about consciousness, and he found a way to measure consciousness. So I'm going to give you the simple version today. He talked about how people at the sacred or the highest level of consciousness are visionary leaders that think about the planet, about themselves, about others and the planet, all as integrated wholes. And sacred leaders choose to work on their levels of consciousness in order to reach higher levels of consciousness. So they deal with their feelings, they deal with their own ways of behaving, and they choose to transform negative behaviour patterns into positive ones. It is an emotional and spiritual process, not an entirely intellectual one. Although intellect is very important, it's an entirely emotional and spiritual process. So, human beings are leaders in companies, that business people cannot be separated from the spiritual or sacred aspect of themselves. Robert Keegan said that some of the people he considered sacred leaders are these people here. So Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, this is Kumanara Randall, who was my cultural father, Mother Teresa, Chief Seattle, and Daddy Yankee. And so these are some of the people that he considered to be at a higher level of consciousness. So how does sacred leadership happen? Well, actually it occurs in our developmental and education processes in society. So basically everybody grows up in a family. We call that your family of origin. And families of origin are part of a bigger system which we call our society. Erik Erikson, who was a Freudian psychologist who also taught at Harvard and was a student of Freud, developed the human psychosocial developmental system. So basically he said this is how we develop our emotional intelligence. And I'll show you what that is in a minute. But basically we grow up in an education system. We have parents, peers, colleagues, teachers who help us develop as human beings from birth right through to death. And it's those people that encourage us to be certain ways. It's how we learn to be the way we are and make the choices that we make. I've put in a little bit about how Aboriginal culture actually does that in a very positive and functional way. So what happens in your family of origin? So this comes out of family systems theory, which is also part of my PhD work, but it's also been really a life story for me to examine family systems in order to understand my own, but also in order to understand how Aboriginal people are traumatised by colonisation. But for today, Keegan and Erikson and the people who developed in this field of sacred leadership talked about families being the most important unit where we learn to develop in a healthy way. So if you grow up in any of these 4 families, or 5th family, I've added Indigenous people because they are colonised and therefore traumatised, your development will be arrested at some stage in your life. So if one or both of your parents or your grandparents, because we now know, it's proven by family therapists' research, that it passes generationally. So if there are chemical dependence in your parentage, that means they're addicted to alcohol or other drugs. If there is a sexual, physical or emotional violence in that family, but also it's been extended into social, spiritual and cultural abuse of any type. If there is mentally ill parentage or psychologically damaged, so anyone with a diagnosed mental illness. And I've added acculturated or colonised families, which is the trauma that besets Indigenous people, particularly here in Australia, but in other countries as well. So in those families, we know that development gets arrested. The important period of time that development gets arrested, according to Erikson, is between 0 and 7 years. So if something happens to you in your family of origin, you get taken away, you get fostered out, adopted out, removed, you are abused in any way, physically, sexually or otherwise. If your parents have a chemical dependency, they will eventually emotionally and physically abandon you at some point. And you will grow up with a sense of deep shame. And children in those developmental early years develop fear, hurt, grief and terror. And they don't know how and why. We know that human beings begin to rationalise at the age of 5. So from 0 to 5, everything is embedded in your life as a memory, in your brain as a memory. We don't rationalise or use logic about why we feel the way we feel. It's not until we're around about 5 that we start to do that. So those early development years are very important, and you will see later why a leader who has development arrested in these early years will stay at the lowest level of consciousness. And you will have met people like this. So, this is a very important period of time for the ego. You know, everything is about me, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. Certainly the teenage years are very important because it's where we learn industry and intimacy, but those early development years are the most important. So just to give you a bit of sense, I'm not going to read all of these out, but healthy development in early adulthood, for example, most people fall in love, get married and have a family. If your development is arrested, you'll be unable to develop intimacy with other people. So you'll go from relationship to relationship. You'll end up in difficult relationships, either emotionally or physically violent relationships, or maybe sexually violent relationships, and you will have difficulties throughout the life. So it's in our family of origin where we learn to develop healthy intimacy. And now that I'm a grandmother, you know, I've already had conversations with Erika about how do we make sure this little baby doesn't get traumatised. I mean, there's only so much you can do as a parent, because children go to school, you can't watch them 24/7. They get bullied, things happen to them, but certainly you want to avoid the gross parts of traumatic arrested development. So Keegan basically said that anyone that stays at that lower level will end up. These are his 5 levels of consciousness. And I've got 4 there, but that's because interdependent is between independent and sacred. So basically he said, level 1, stage 1 is egocentric, stage 2 is socialised, stage 3 is independent, stage 4 is interdependent, and stage 5 is sacred. And each of these stages has a set of qualities and value systems that are noticeably present in that person. And how it fits with Erikson's model, which is how he used it, was to say that if you develop through these stages, you will end up in one of these stages. So the interesting thing is that if anyone has arrested development to age 7, they're going to stay at egocentric. And 15% of leaders of companies, he discovered, stayed at 15%. The majority of people stay in socialised, and I'll explain what they mean in a second. So basically that just says what I just said. And sacred develops over the lifespan, but often it's elder people that have that wisdom of lived experience. But of course it can develop earlier. It depends on the system in which you're brought up. So I thought he was a great example. I mean, it's probably a bit mean, but, you know, I did it with a chuckle. So egocentric is where 15% of the world leaders stay. So it's all about my needs. It's all about what I need. And I make decisions based on me. I don't make decisions based on other people or how I can make other people work together. It's all about me. And it's often, you know, if you think of some of the military leaders in the world in the past, as well as these leaders, and certainly kings and queens have done this. Socialised. This is where the major percentage of the population of leaders stay. 60%. They're incapable of perceiving themselves as separate from being the president, the CEO, you know, the this, the that, the professor, the whatever. I knew someone once who, an Indigenous woman who got a degree from Harvard and became a professor and couldn't stand it if anyone in our community didn't call her professor or doctor. And at the time, I didn't know anything about this, but I thought, she's older than me, I'll be respectful. But now I've come to understand, and it was an achievement for her. It was an important achievement. So for her, for us to say, hello, Professor so-and-so, or Dr. so-and-so, was something we were acknowledging that she had done certain things. But in a workplace, it's often very difficult if somebody is constantly attached to their role, to their achievements, to their possessions. Oh, you know, I got the latest Lexus, I got the latest four-wheel drive Jag. I've seen those ads lately. I mean, they're just predictably horrible. So I've got the latest this, or I live on the waterfront, or I'm this, or I'm that. And you can put this into the context of your own lives. You've seen people in these roles. So moving into independent, 25% of the population can actually begin to have the courage to look at themselves. So they look at themselves and they decide, actually, I want to do something different. If anyone wants these PowerPoint slides, they'll be on my academia page. So you can download them later. I'm quite happy for you to have them as long as you acknowledge them as copyright. Because you know us academics, we're a bit attached to our we're very attached to our work. I'm a bit socialised in that way. No, I give them away because all the people in my community say, well, that stuff doesn't belong to you. It's like a sacred song. It doesn't just belong to me, it belongs to all the people that sang it before me. So most people at Independent have a very good, strong sense of their own self, and they know that their authority comes from within themselves, not the power or the money or the position. They have good boundaries. They set their own boundaries, they stick to their boundaries, and they help other people do the same. So we don't have people in workplaces who are inappropriate, sexually harassing other people or subordinates at this level, because they know that's usually at egocentric level. They speak for themselves and they understand difference and they enjoy mentoring other people, and they're ready to serve, they're ready to give. At interdependent, which is the period just before sacred, there's quite a lot of people at this level, well, 12%, that's probably a good amount. But these are the characteristics of people who've entered an interdependent stage. They recognise their own power, they claim their power, and they use it as a force for change. They are responsible in the truest sense. They don't blame other people. We have a big society of blame, self-blame, as well as blaming. Everybody wants to, something happens in our society. Who's to blame? Who's to blame that the dam broke? Who's to blame that the helicopter fell out of the sky? You know, there's always something about blame. They deal well with conflict. So you could think back through people in your life or people who've been your bosses or your mentors. You may have met somebody at interdependent. And then Keegan said that it's sacred. In terms of the entire population, he says that 1% reach sacred in terms of these qualities. Even knowing that a person is sacred doesn't mean that they exhibit that sacredness because of the things that have gone on in their life. So these are the qualities, some of the qualities of a sacred being. And often it's about the integration of the whole world in their thinking and in their consciousness. So they're thinking each action that they have each day, its impact on the planet, its impact on the environment, its impact on another person, not just themselves, but all the people in the system. And it's certainly been my experience when I have been with elders who exhibit these qualities and people who've mentored me, that this is the qualities that they exhibit in their practice. So their ways of knowing and being and then the way they put that into action in the world is like this. Often we think these people are a level above us. Like, who can think, oh yeah, I'm like Mother Teresa, or I'm like the Dalai Lama? You know, often we put these people on a pedestal. And I've read Nelson Mandela's books, and it's very interesting to listen to his family because they describe him as a human being, as their father, as a parent, you know, and it's like he's a normal person like the rest of us. But it was the courage with which he faced his life and did the things that he did that made a huge difference. And I know one of his daughters used to talk about how very strict he was. And perhaps that's another thing. He was very good at setting boundaries for his children. But then he had many years away from them. So often people at Sacred display a courage of facing things and being able to move through them in such a way and come out the other side, often with a great deal of love. In fact, I see love as a very deep aspect of the quality of sacredness. There's an ability to have unconditional love for the self, for other people, and for the planet. And certainly Kumanara Randall, whose photo I showed you earlier, was that way with all people that came to his country. He welcomed anyone to his family home with open arms. You could go and stay there. And it was a very important aspect. I show this picture because one of the things I know about my culture, having grown up in it and having been educated in Western culture, is that there is an aspect of our culture that we have held on to which is extremely sacred. And that is the spiritual aspect, the knowledge of our history, the value system, and the way in which we have kept it within ourselves. We still follow the laws of respect. We still do sharing and caring, which are aspects of our law and our culture that we are taught you have to do. So regardless of my opinion of another person, especially if that person is older than me, I must respect them in public. So this is just a little map to show you, well, we are the oldest living culture on the earth. It's been proven, and people often say it now. And thank you to the academics who've gone about and proven that we've been here a lot longer than many other cultures. So if you ever have the opportunity to go onto YouTube, you can watch Kumanara Randall's film called Kanyini, where he describes how we've been here while the Egyptians were living in Egypt, while the Celts and the Vikings were conquering the north. We were here living the way that we lived. And our culture comes out of the ancestors who travelled here and left the law here. And we have followed that ever since. There's even been research to prove that there's no Chinese whispers in our culture, that everything that was orally passed on was passed on exactly as it should be and it didn't get changed. Because that's often the thing. Conversations can change from one person to the next, but they've proven that it doesn't happen in our culture. So what is important about sacredness? How do we reach the highest level of consciousness? By considering myself as a soul, as a spirit, a Kurumpa, which is our language, but also as a human being. But it is the soul or the spirit that is the sacred part of me, and it's that part of me that drives my human form. And I have, you might call sacred business a value system. That would be another word for it. But it's a value system by which you live, which we could call a spiritual system. So what happens in Aboriginal culture that makes the development of sacred leaders, and in my research I called it the road to eldership, Jukapapulka, so sacred leadership in action, in which people exhibit sacredness as elders. So our society actually was developed in a very functional way. In fact, I think it was John Pilger who said in The Secret Country that we had the most purest democracy in the world because there's not one leader. Everyone who is an elder and invited to be an elder is invited because of their sacredness and their capacity to be that way, and they govern the country, or the clan. And it's usually half women and half men. And everybody above the age of initiation, which is around 12, 14, gets to speak as a leader. You're invited to have your opinion and you're you're expected to express it. So from teenagehood onwards, you're developed into a role of leadership with the potential to become an elder. Elder men and elder women look after the whole clan. The law is always the core of action, of being. So the law is always considered the central part of any system of governance, education, development, action, everything is based on the law. And there are a number of foundational laws that every clan lives by. And then, of course, they have their own way of living those laws. This is just a little picture to show you that there's always half a circle is women, half a circle is men. When we come together to do community business, men sit on half the circle, the women sit on the other half, and the children or the initiated boys and girls are also part of that circle, and the centre is always the consideration of the laws. So what happens in an Aboriginal system? It's a system established to create sacred eldership. So to enable a person to get to a point in their life, often in older age, where their peers would say, yes, we see in action the sorts of qualities we consider to be sacred leadership. And that whole system of learning is a series of circles which you go through. So when you're initiated, you know you're going into the next group, and there's an expectation that you learn certain things and you behave in a certain way. And then when you become a parent, you go into the next group of teachers, and you spend the core of your life in the teaching role. Well, certainly in my life I did, from 20s to 30s, 40s, 50s. Now that I'm 60, I'm sort of moving towards, and certainly in my own mind, I want to move towards eldership. But when young ones start to call you auntie and uncle, it's a sign of respect. And so that started in my 50s. And so now I've just turned 60. I think the next 15, 20 years are about developing those qualities. Certainly it's the choice that I've made in my life. So for us, being an elder is being a leader. And the whole system is developed through the whole life to move you in that direction. Some people will choose at a certain point in an older age where they don't actually want to be the elders, because they have to make the judgments, they have to do the discerning, they have to make all the decisions. And of course, if you correlate this with your own life, think about who are the elders, who are the leaders of our life. Often we think of them as being the politicians. They're the sort of the heads of the leaders of our society, because they make the laws, they develop the policies, they put them into practice. And then within our groups and within our businesses, we have leaders as well. But who would be our elders? Who would we think are our elders in Australia? It's all a bit of a mix-match-motchy kind of thing, isn't it? Like, who are they? People say it's the politicians, but by the way they act, most of them are in the egocentric or socialised, you have to say. You have to think anyway. So just a bit of a sharing about two different systems. And I only say it's dysfunctional because I was brought up in the sort of therapeutic life, learning about dysfunctionality and functionality. And I see my system in its wholeness before white people came and changed, it had to change and it has changed. But there are pockets of it where it has not changed. So, for example, where Kumanara and my grandmother now live as traditional owners of Uluru, they've got a little microcosm there that has never changed. It's the same as this on the left. They've not moved into a form of dysfunctionality despite the impact of white people. My grandmother saw her first white person when she was 16. And for her value system, it's not that. And so it doesn't matter to her. It's there, but it doesn't impact so much. It has changed parts of it, but they live their law in a very deep way because it's ingrained in them from birth. And so these things are really part of the life. They operate in that. They have very deep intuition. I can tell when she's coming down the road because she sends a message ahead, mind to mind. We develop that. We learn to develop, and we teach our children to develop that ESP or psychological connection between each other where we share messages through the silence. And you would know people like that. So How do we enable sacredness, you ask, would be the next question. How do I do that in my life? How do I do that in professional life? Do I want to? So it's about the three things being integrated and cohesive: being, knowing and doing. What I know, what I be in my own way, and then how I act in the world. So this is how we do it, and I would say that it's a good template for the rest of society because all of these things are important. So Walcha is your family relationships, Kurumpa is yourself, Bayami is the higher being. Most people in Western culture have a belief in the higher being of some sort, no matter what religion you are. We, of course, talk about it in a spiritual way, not a religious, organised way. And Nura, which is your land or your country. So we all have a connection to the earth and the planet. And so much now, there's much bigger movements in the world to protect the planet, to look after it. We know that climate change, for example, is impacting on the planet and on the animals in it, and on the rivers and on the mountains. And so it's important that we take care of it. Certainly, in watching my elders do that, they are very careful about their actions on the earth and their feelings. Kumanara Randall would never get angry at such a degree that that anger would be transferred into the world. If he was angry, he would say, "I'm angry," but he wouldn't go around being violent and kicking the dog or doing something dreadful. Because the belief in the system of Kanyini, in that law, is that you do not allow the negative energy that you feel to expand out into the world. You very carefully contain it because it can have an impact. That negative energy can have an impact on that tree or that plant. And for them, those trees and that plant are their family. It's their Nura, their land. So we call this, all of these aspects working together, Kanyini Jungoku. Kanyini means to essentially to be at the very deep level in complete harmony and unconditional love with the self, with everyone else, and with the planet. And you make a commitment to maintain that harmony. So this is the first law that was ever taught to me. And this law helps you live in the harmony that allows you to be a sacred being. The three laws of respect, we call it. The first is to have respect for the self. So when I have respect for the self and I do that first, it means that when I enter into intimate relationships with anyone, I don't allow them to abuse me. I know how to set boundaries. I know what I'm going to take from someone. I'm not going to feel someone else's feelings before myself. I'm not going to become codependent to them. I'm not going to allow another person to be violent or abusive to me. These are not idealistic things. This is possible. I remember the day when I made a decision that I was not going to have any more abusive people in my life. And there were members of my family I had to say no to, that I had to just not talk to anymore, because I didn't want to hear abuse. No human being deserves it. And so to respect and honour the self was to say, no, I will not have that in my life. And it's hard to do. We get addicted to relationships. We get enmeshed in dysfunctional relationships. It's not easy. But it's practice. It's practice. And these you spend your whole life practicing in order to get good at. I remember I've spent 50 years of my life doing the respect and honour other people. So respecting and honouring other people, we do that with everyone in our life. Can you imagine being told that when you're young and your first initiation is to go and commit to doing that? Yes, for the rest of my life, I'm going to respect and honour every person I'm going to come in contact with. Even those coppers over there that dragged my cousin to jail. Even that one there who said something dreadful. Because we know that the actions are not actually the person. They're the actions of something that happened to that person. And if we have empathy, mercy and compassion, it's possible to have respect. It doesn't mean that I don't put my hand up and say, no, I'm not going to put up with that. It doesn't mean that I can't disagree with someone. But I can disagree and say I disagree, but still have respect for that person. It's very hard in workplace situations if there's a position of power and someone's playing power with you. It's very hard to stand up with these rules. And imagine us. You know, I remember the day I came into white culture, and I came from Nogo Station, where my family lived, and we moved into Longridge, one of the most racist towns in Western Queensland. We were the only black family there. And I went to a Catholic boarding school, and Rhonda's standing there saying, "You little black nigger." And my mother's like teaching me, "You're not allowed to have a go at Rhonda." So what am I going to do with Rhonda? You know, one day my mother said, "Be clever. Say something clever back to Rhonda. That'll shut her up." And so I had to go away and think about what was clever. And as I got older and older and put up with her for years, my brother threatened to come and punch her lights out. I said, "No, my mother won't let you do that." So I discovered that niggers were not Aboriginal people. Niggers were African Americans. Yeah? So I went to Rhonda one day, I think I was 6 or 7, and I said, "You know what, Rhonda? I'm not a nigger, I'm a Waka Waka, and you better respect me, because a nigger is an African American. Do I look African American to you?" And my mother said it was very clever. And Rhonda never did it again. And when I saw Rhonda at our reunion, 20 years later, she wouldn't talk to me. I thought, can you hold on to something for so long? Because in our day, it was the black kids that got kicked out of school if they got called niggers, and we retaliated. You got kicked out of school. And I love school too much to get kicked out of school, so I wasn't going to let Rhonda take over my education. So, Kanyini to be. So this is the main law that helps with the sacredness. Caring for all living things, being in service of other beings and the animals. Having congruence in thoughts, words and actions. So I'm not sitting in my car raging on the road, you know, "I hate Asians, they can't drive," or something dreadful like that, like really horrible things that people say about people. My father used to say, "Never drive behind a man with a hat." And I'm like, what? Every cocky in this town has got a hat, you know, but he's like, "They're mad." Or, you know, "Don't go near any of the Migloos, they're mad." And I'm thinking, So, you know, the older you get, the wiser you get, the more congruent your thoughts, words and actions have to become. So what I'm thinking inside has to be the same as what I'm saying and doing, not, you know, raging at this one over here and then going away over here and putting on the nice face. You know, it's that two-faced business that you can't do. So the important part of Kanyini is to have that interrelationship between family, belief system or value system, the laws by which you live, and the land which takes care of us. So another part of the laws, so these laws are the things that we're taught in our culture that help us grow into being sacred leaders. The law of mutual reciprocity, Napaji Napaji, is where we share and care with each other. So this is giving and receiving done, you know, in a good way. So if I do something for someone, I don't have to ask for anything in return. Eventually they'll return it in a good way. They'll do something for me. So in our culture, we're very generous with the sharing and caring. We do it a lot, and it's very deeply ingrained in the way that we're brought up. So let's talk about the professional life. This is why you're here. It's all about your work. But just remember that you are you, and being in your workplace, you are still you. You don't separate yourself when you walk through the door and go, "Oh, I'm the automated work person now," and then when I go home, I'm all different. We're the same wherever we are. So how do we become? So we recognise the self is sacred. This is how I was taught. We begin to live the laws of respect, Kanyini, Napaji, Napaji. We begin to practice that in our relationships in the community and with each other, in our intimate relationships. And we also begin to do it in the workplace and in the world. And so we think deeply about what it is you believe, what it is you practice, and how you do that. We begin to integrate sacredness through all those aspects of the life. And this is how we live it. Essentially, I was taught by my elders that essentially at our core, We crave peace because peace is our natural state. That's what they told me. Being at peace is your natural state. Sitting in the land, in the bush, in the quietness, that's my natural state. Imagine that, being told that. And then running into a world where there's not a lot of peace and having to maintain that peace. So I was taught it's very important to contemplate. You might call it meditation. We say Dadiri. It's very important to do a practice that enables us to be still. So we might put different words in here for you. We might say we align our values to the values of my value system, and I follow my belief system in all things. So I've said most of that already, and you can read it. Nanjanatia means the earth, the planet. That's our mother. So Nanjanatia means that. So that's the land we call Australia. So there's Kumanara Randall. So what would sacredness look like? It's an active practice, sacredness. It's not about religion. Get that out of your mind. You know, I've had some pretty bad run-ins with the Catholic Church in my day because I grew up in Catholic boarding schools. And I know the difference between fork-tongued people. They say one thing in church and they do another thing somewhere else. And for me, that's not sacred. So you practice your value system in action. And you actively want to transform systems. I remember when I first started working as a director in policy in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and I wanted to develop policy that had an impact to transform systems on the ground. And I remember being in that bureaucracy, and of course I couldn't do any of that, could I? That wasn't what it was about. It wasn't, I was put in income support, right, looking after disability pensions and all of this, about 18 years ago. And I was appalled, because John Howard was the Prime Minister then, I was appalled at some of the things they were doing, and I refused to go and be involved in taking people off disability pensions in order to save the budget. I just refused. Of course, it was noted on my personnel file. But there were some things that I couldn't do. It wasn't fair. We were there to transform systems for people in Australia. And so I had this altruistic purpose, which didn't really fit. But I still kept doing it. I still kept trying. I was asked to write the Cabinet submission for welfare reform when Noel Pearson brought in all of that. And I refused because I didn't agree with it. I didn't agree with taking Centrelink payments off people who were already poor just because we wanted to stop them drinking. There were other ways to do things. So these are just words. But as I've already noted, you know, we think about people like Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela and others, and they're in the world for an altruistic purpose. They're sharing to help the world become a better place. Yes, they're human beings, and yes, they have negative traits, but in the end, the majority of their action and work and purpose is to make this place a better place for us all. And that's certainly how I've seen individual elders in my life. I've had mentors in the Aboriginal community who thought only of my well-being, and especially when there were difficult times. And I try to do that now for other young people in a very altruistic way. I don't need them to pay me. I have a job I can make money from. It's about growing up the next generation to make the world a better place, and isn't that what we want? Thank you, everyone. Thank you.